The explosion hit without warning, turning the world into a nightmare of twisted metal and screaming chaos. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez felt the Humvee flip through the air like a toy, before crashing down in a thunderous impact that shook his bones. When the ringing in his ears finally stopped, he realized he was trapped under tons of burning wreckage in the middle of hostile territory in Afghanistan. Blood poured from a deep gash across his forehead, and his left leg was pinned beneath a heavy piece of the vehicle's frame. The roadside bomb had been perfectly placed, catching their convoy at the worst possible moment as they traveled through a narrow mountain pass. His 3 teammates lay motionless around him, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than the explosion itself. Marcus tried to move, but immediately felt sharp pain shooting through his ribs. At least 2 were broken, maybe more. His radio was somewhere in the wreckage, crackling with static and desperate voices calling for their unit to respond. He could hear enemy fighters moving closer, their voices carried on the desert wind as they approached to check their handiwork. The young soldier had joined the army to serve his country, leaving behind a wife and 2 small children in Texas. He had promised them he would come home safely, and that promise now seemed impossible to keep. The metal pressing down on his leg grew heavier by the minute, and he could feel his strength slowly draining away with each drop of blood that fell onto the dusty ground beneath him. As darkness began to fall over the Afghan mountains, Marcus made a decision that would define the next several days of his life. He would not give up. He would not let his family receive that terrible knock on the door. With every ounce of determination he possessed, he began the slow, agonizing process of trying to free himself from the wreckage. The enemy voices grew closer, and Marcus knew he had to stay absolutely silent. One sound could mean capture or death. He bit down on a piece of torn fabric to muffle any noise as he worked to shift the heavy metal beam. Hours passed like torture, but slowly, painfully. He managed to create just enough space to pull his mangled leg free. When he finally crawled out from under the destroyed vehicle, Marcus discovered the full horror of his situation. He was alone in enemy territory with severe injuries, no communication and hostile forces hunting for survivors. The nearest friendly outpost was more than 20 miles away through dangerous mountain terrain that even healthy soldiers found challenging. But Marcus Rodriguez was far from giving up. As he looked up at the star-filled Afghan sky, he made a silent vow to his family back home. He would survive this nightmare no matter what it took. He would find a way to make it through the darkness and return to the people he loved most in the world. Marcus began his journey through hell with nothing but the clothes on his back and a fierce determination to survive. His injured leg dragged behind him as he crawled away from the wreckage, leaving a trail of blood on the rocky ground. The mountain air was freezing cold, and his torn uniform provided little protection against the bitter wind that cut through the Afghan night like a knife. Every movement sent waves of pain through his broken ribs, but he forced himself to keep moving. The enemy search parties were still out there, sweeping the area with flashlights and calling to each other in the darkness. Marcus had to put distance between himself and the crash site. Before dawn revealed his location to hostile eyes, he found a small cave carved into the mountainside just as the first light of morning began to appear on the horizon. The cramped space was barely large enough for his body, but it offered precious shelter from both the elements and enemy patrols. Marcus collapsed inside, his body shaking from cold pain and exhaustion that went deeper than anything he had ever experienced. Water became his first priority as the desert sun climbed higher and began turning his rocky shelter into an oven. His lips were already cracking from dehydration, and he knew he had perhaps 2 days before his body would begin shutting down. Using his military training, Marcus waited until the hottest part of the day when enemy patrols would seek shelter, then ventured out to search for any source of moisture. A small trickle of water seeping from between 2 rocks became his salvation. It was barely more than a few drops per hour, but Marcus positioned his torn shirt beneath the tiny stream and waited patiently for enough liquid to collect. The water tasted of minerals and dirt, but it was life itself flowing down his parched throat. Food proved even more challenging to find in the barren landscape. Marcus discovered some tough mountain grass and a few bitter berries that his survival training had taught him were safe to eat. His stomach cramped with hunger, but he rationed the meager findings carefully, knowing they might be all that stood between him and starvation. As night fell again, Marcus made the difficult decision to continue his journey toward friendly territory. His leg had swollen to twice its normal size, and every step felt like walking on broken glass. But staying in one place meant certain death, either from his injuries, exposure, or eventual discovery by enemy forces who were surely still searching for survivors. The second night of travel proved even more brutal than the first. The temperature dropped below freezing, and Marcus had to stop frequently to prevent his body from going into shock. He created a crude splint for his leg using strips of fabric and a straight piece of wood, but the makeshift medical care could only do so much for his serious injuries. By dawn of the third day, Marcus had covered less than 5 miles from the crash site. At this rate, reaching safety would take weeks that he simply did not have. His body was failing him, his water was running low, and the constant pain was beginning to affect his ability to think clearly. But somewhere deep inside, the image of his wife and children kept him moving forward, one agonizing step at a time. The fourth day brought new horrors that tested Marcus beyond anything he thought possible. Infection had set into his leg wound, turning the skin around the injury an angry red color and filling his body with fever. He drifted in and out of consciousness as he stumbled through the rocky terrain, sometimes unsure if he was moving forward or walking in circles through his pain-induced delirium. Hallucinations began plaguing his journey as dehydration and blood loss took their toll on his weakened mind. Marcus saw his wife calling to him from distant hilltops and heard his children's laughter echoing through empty valleys. These visions were both a comfort and a torture, reminding him of everything he was fighting to return to, while highlighting how far away home truly was. During one of his brief moments of clarity, Marcus spotted movement in the valley below. His heart hammered with terror as he recognized the distinctive clothing and weapons of enemy fighters conducting another search patrol. They were methodically checking every cave, every outcropping, every possible hiding place where a survivor might take shelter. Their persistence was both impressive and terrifying. Marcus pressed himself against a boulder and remained motionless for over 6 hours while the patrol passed dangerously close to his position. The fever made him want to shiver uncontrollably, but he forced his body to remain still as stone. One of the fighters came within 10 feet of his hiding spot, close enough that Marcus could see the man's face and smell the smoke from his cigarette. When the patrol finally moved on, Marcus discovered his situation had become even more desperate. His water supply was completely exhausted, and his body was beginning to shut down from the combination of injuries, infection, and exposure. The rational part of his mind told him that survival was impossible, that he should find a comfortable place to lie down and accept his fate with dignity. But Marcus Rodriguez was not a man who accepted defeat easily. As darkness fell on his fourth night in the wilderness, he made a decision that seemed crazy but represented his only remaining chance. Instead of continuing his slow crawl toward distant safety, he would take a massive risk and head toward a known enemy position, where he had spotted signs of a water source. The enemy camp was situated near a small stream that flowed down from the mountain peaks. It was the first running water Marcus had seen since the crash, and his body desperately needed the life-giving liquid if he had any hope of surviving long enough to reach friendly territory. But getting to that stream meant crossing open ground under the noses of hostile fighters who would kill him without hesitation. Marcus spent hours studying the enemy camp from a distance, memorizing the guard patterns and identifying the best approach route. The fighters seemed confident that no survivors remained in the area, and their security was more relaxed than it should have been. This overconfidence might be the tiny advantage Marcus needed to accomplish the impossible. As the moon disappeared behind thick clouds, providing precious darkness for his desperate mission, Marcus began crawling toward the enemy camp. Every movement had to be perfect, every sound carefully controlled. His life depended on remaining invisible to trained fighters who were occupying his only path to survival. The stream was less than 100 yards away, but it might as well have been on the other side of the world. Between Marcus and the water lay an open field, 2 alert guards, and the very real possibility that his incredible journey would end in capture or death just when salvation seemed within reach. Marcus waited until the guards changed shifts at midnight, then began the most dangerous crawl of his life. His injured leg screamed in protest with every movement, but he forced himself to move like a ghost across the open ground. The loose rocks beneath him seemed to echo like gunshots in the silence, and his ragged breathing sounded impossibly loud in his own ears. Halfway to the stream, one of the guards turned in his direction. Marcus froze completely, not even daring to breathe as the fighter's eyes swept across the darkness where he lay pressed against the cold earth. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 hours. The guard stared directly at Marcus's position. Then, apparently seeing nothing unusual, the man turned away and resumed his patrol. When Marcus finally reached the stream, he wanted to plunge his entire head into the cool water and drink until his stomach burst. Instead, his military training took over, and he carefully sipped small amounts while watching for any sign that he had been discovered. The water was the most beautiful thing he had ever tasted, and he felt strength flowing back into his battered body with every precious drop. Marcus filled every container he could find with water, including his torn shirt and empty pockets. He knew this might be his last chance to access clean water for many days, and his survival depended on making the most of this opportunity. As he prepared to begin the dangerous journey back to safety, he heard voices approaching from the enemy camp. 2 fighters were walking directly toward his position by the stream, engaged in what sounded like a heated argument. Marcus had nowhere to hide in the open area around the water, and his injured leg made quick movement impossible. In desperation, he rolled into the shallow stream itself and pressed his body against the muddy bank, hoping the darkness and flowing water would provide enough camouflage to save his life. The fighters reached the stream just a few feet from where Marcus lay submerged up to his neck in the freezing water. They continued their argument while one of them filled a water container, apparently oblivious to the wounded American soldier, lying motionless beneath the surface just arm's length away. Marcus held his breath until his lungs burned and spots danced before his eyes. When the fighters finally moved away, Marcus emerged from the water like a half-drowned ghost. His body temperature had dropped dangerously low and he was shivering so violently that he could barely control his movements. But he was alive, he had water, and he had managed to accomplish the impossible by infiltrating an enemy position and escaping undetected. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of pain, determination, and sheer willpower. Marcus pushed his broken body beyond every reasonable limit, covering ground that should have been impossible for someone in his condition. He rationed his water carefully, found shelter during the hottest parts of the day, and somehow managed to avoid the continued enemy patrols that swept through the area. His infected leg had begun to smell terrible, and Marcus knew that gangrene was setting in. Without proper medical treatment soon he would lose the limb or possibly his life. But he was getting closer to friendly territory with each agonizing step, and the thought of seeing his family again drove him forward when logic said he should give up. On the 7th night after the crash, Marcus reached a ridgeline that overlooked a valley he recognized from his unit's maps. Somewhere in that valley was an American outpost, but he would have to cross several miles of open terrain to reach it. His body was failing rapidly, and he wasn't sure he had the strength left for one final push toward salvation. As dawn broke over the Afghan mountains, Marcus Rodriguez began what he knew would be either his last day as a missing soldier or his last day alive. Either way, his incredible journey through hell was about to reach its dramatic conclusion. Marcus began his final descent into the valley as the sun climbed higher, knowing that daylight would make him visible to anyone watching from the surrounding hills. His leg had swollen so badly that his boot had split open, and the infection was spreading up toward his hip with angry red streaks that meant blood poisoning was taking hold of his system. Every step down the rocky slope was agony, but Marcus forced himself to maintain a steady pace. He could see dust clouds in the distance that might indicate vehicle movement around the American outpost, but the heat shimmer rising from the valley floor made it impossible to identify specific details. Hope and desperation warred in his chest as he stumbled toward what might be salvation, or might be another enemy position. Halfway across the valley floor, Marcus heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the desert air. He looked up to see 2 military helicopters approaching from the direction of the outpost, flying low and fast in a search pattern. His heart leaped with the possibility that these might be American aircraft looking for survivors from his unit's destroyed convoy. Marcus tried to signal the helicopters by waving his torn shirt above his head, but his weakened arms could barely lift the fabric. The aircraft passed directly overhead without showing any sign that they had spotted the lone figure, struggling across the desert below. They disappeared over the next ridge, leaving Marcus alone again with his fading hopes and failing body. The sound of approaching engines made Marcus look back toward the hills he had just descended. A convoy of vehicles was moving down the same path he had taken, and even from a distance he could tell they were not American. The enemy had finally picked up his trail and was closing in for the final confrontation that Marcus had managed to avoid for more than a week. With the last reserves of strength in his battered body, Marcus pushed himself toward a cluster of rocks that offered the only cover in the open valley. His infected leg gave out completely, and he collapsed in the meager shade just as the enemy vehicles reached the valley floor. Through the haze of fever and exhaustion, he watched armed fighters spread out to search the area where he was hiding. Marcus checked his remaining supplies and found almost nothing left to sustain him. His water was gone, his makeshift medical supplies were exhausted, and his body was shutting down from the combination of blood loss, infection, and pure physical trauma. The enemy was closing in, and he no longer had the strength to run or fight. As the hostile fighters approached his hiding place, Marcus thought about his wife reading bedtime stories to their children back in Texas. He pictured their faces and tried to send them a mental message that he had fought as hard as possible to come home. The promise he had made to return safely was about to be broken, but not because he had given up or stopped trying. The sound of the approaching enemy fighters grew louder, their voices calling to each other as they systematically searched every possible hiding spot in the rocky area. Marcus could hear their boots crunching on the gravel just a few feet from where he lay concealed, and he knew that discovery was only moments away. But then another sound cut through the desert air, different from anything Marcus had heard during his week-long nightmare. It was the deep, powerful roar of American military aircraft approaching at high speed, and this time they were coming in much lower than before. The enemy fighters had heard it too, and their casual search pattern suddenly became urgent as they realized they might be about to face a superior force. Marcus used his last bit of energy to crawl to the edge of his rocky shelter and look up at the sky. What he saw there filled him with a hope so powerful that tears began streaming down his dirt-covered face for the first time since the explosion that had started his incredible journey. The helicopters that appeared over the ridge were unlike anything Marcus had seen during his deployment. These were sleek, heavily armed aircraft that moved with the precision and confidence of elite special operations forces. As they descended toward the valley floor, Marcus could see tactical teams preparing to fast rope down into the combat zone, where he lay dying among the rocks. The enemy fighters immediately opened fire on the incoming aircraft, but their small arms were no match for the superior firepower and training of the special operations team. Within minutes, the hostile force was either eliminated or had fled back into the surrounding hills, leaving the valley under American control for the first time in Marcus's week-long ordeal. Navy SEALs hit the ground running, spreading out in perfect formation to secure the area and search for any sign of the missing soldier they had been sent to find. Marcus tried to call out to them, but his voice came out as barely more than a whisper through his cracked and swollen lips. He managed to raise one trembling hand above the rocks where he was hiding, hoping someone would notice the slight movement. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, the SEAL team leader, spotted the barely visible hand signal through his high-powered scope. He immediately directed his team toward Marcus's position while maintaining overwatch for any remaining enemy threats. When the SEALs reached the rocky outcropping, they found a soldier who looked more dead than alive, but whose eyes still burned with the fierce determination that had kept him fighting for survival, against impossible odds. Marcus tried to speak, to tell the SEALs his name and unit information, but the words wouldn't come. His body had finally reached the absolute limit of human endurance, and he was slipping in and out of consciousness, even as the medical specialist began emergency treatment for his infected wounds and severe dehydration. The SEALs worked with practiced efficiency, establishing an IV line and preparing Marcus for immediate evacuation to the nearest field hospital. As the medical helicopter lifted off from the valley floor, Marcus caught a glimpse of the terrain he had somehow managed to cross during his week in hell. From the air, the distance looked impossible for a healthy soldier, let alone someone with his severe injuries. The SEAL medic working on him shook his head in amazement and told Marcus that his survival was nothing short of miraculous. The next few days passed in a blur of surgeries, medications, and worried faces of doctors who couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. Marcus's infected leg required multiple operations to save it from amputation, and his other injuries had pushed his body to the very edge of what was survivable. But he was alive, he was safe, and he was finally on his way home to the family that had never stopped believing he would return. When Marcus Rodriguez finally stepped off the transport plane at the airbase in Texas, his wife and children were waiting on the tarmac with tears streaming down their faces. His 2-year-old daughter didn't recognize the thin, scarred man with the pronounced limp, but his 6-year-old son ran straight into his arms and refused to let go for the longest time. The doctor said Marcus's recovery would take months of physical therapy, and that he would always walk with a slight limp from his injured leg. But none of that mattered to the soldier who had survived 8 days in enemy territory through sheer force of will and an unbreakable promise to his family. He was home, he was alive, and he had proven that the human spirit could overcome even the most impossible circumstances. Years later, Marcus would receive the Medal of Honor for his extraordinary survival and the intelligence he gathered about enemy positions during his harrowing journey. But the medal that meant the most to him was a simple drawing his daughter made showing a soldier walking through mountains, with the words, "My daddy never gives up," written in crayon across the bottom. That picture still hangs on his office wall, a daily reminder of the promise that saved his life and brought him home.